ownership is a spectrum. And so like certain applications, you'll have a higher level of ownership, and other applications, you might have a lower level of ownership, but that ownership will still allow you to have some sort of governance or financial or utility upside in the network that you use or contribute to.
Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of the Club podcast. Each week, we bring you long-form conversations with the people building at the edges of crypto and community. At Seed Club, we believe in a world where people, not platforms, capture the value created online, and where community-owned networks are some of the most valuable organizations in the world. Join us for a front row seat to the latest insights and tactical learnings at the intersection of crypto and community. Mason, welcome to the club.
Thanks, Jess. Excited to be on.
I actually don't know how long it's been since we've talked, but definitely remember having some great conversations and some of your early work at Masari and sort of exploring social tokens back in the day. You're trying to dive deep in projects, bring some clarity to folks through your explorations there. So really looking forward to getting into this conversation through that lens. But let's kick it off by just giving a brief introduction. Who are you? What do you spend your days on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Mason Nystrom. I'm an investment partner at Variant on the consumer team. And that means we're focused on early stage investing across, very broadly invest across the stack. So whether it's like infrastructure, DeFi, consumer, I sit on the consumer team. And so I'm looking at the next consumer applications, marketplaces, and communities that will be what Web3 is of tomorrow.
What were you doing previous to Variant?
Yeah, so my kind of quick TLDR, been in crypto since 2017, was working for a cryptocurrency exchange in Hong Kong called Gatecoin, then made my way back to States, joined Consensus on the marketing team. And then most recently, I was at Masari as a research analyst covering Web3 infrastructure, social tokens, DAOs, NFTs, and more.
I mean, the thing that's maybe top of my mind and interesting from what you shared there is just sort of this like consumer lens on crypto, because I think there's like it's one of those sort of shiny objects, big flashy things, huge unlock. We're going to reach the next billion users. I think without a doubt, there's something incredibly powerful and interesting there. And yet on a day-to-day basis, we're still in Web3, mostly building things for folks who are native to Web3. We were just, we're recording this just after some of the Solana wallets are hacked and bridges are hacked, and sort of just the overall, like there's a very real set of barriers on the ground today. And yet I think there's this sort of exciting consumer adoption that's coming in the future. So I'm curious if you could maybe expand a little bit on the thesis you guys are working on around Web3 consumer. What's exciting? We can start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think of like Web3 consumer, we think of anything that a consumer might touch. And that could be something from like a top layer, like a wallet. It could be a new type of social network application. It could be NFTs or marketplaces. And the broad thesis is that the next generation of internet protocols and platforms are going to be user owned. And because that leads to alignment between all stakeholders of the network, whether that's, the buy side, the sell side, the people in the middle, and ultimately that results in better outcomes. And so that's kind of the broad thesis and how consumer fits into it.
Yeah, maybe break that down a little bit. When we think about consumer generally in like the maybe more traditional business world, like there's this B2B and B2C, and consumer apps are really hard. It's the Facebooks, it's the Snaps, it's the physical goods that people are buying, and B2B is the enterprise stuff. And there's sort of like a very different type of organization that gets built there. Are you seeing similar sort of stratification when you're looking into Web3? And I guess maybe behind this is a little bit is one of my working theses is that there is increasingly a fuzzy line between who is sort of a builder and a user, who an investor. And I'm curious if you're sort of seeing some points of differentiation there or how you think about it.
That's a good question. I think that you're right. So much of these networks, because they're public and open source and community driven, you have a lot of people who end up being users, but they also end up being contributors or, having some other function within those communities. And broadly, you have a lot of infrastructure that still needs to be developed on the consumer side. If we look at mobile, like you're still not going to have that super easy app interface that you're going to get on your iPhone. And so although we're really excited about what we'll bring in the next billion users, there's still a lot of infrastructure that exists on the consumer side. And that could be anything from like wallet to wallet messaging or multi-sigs or, seed phrase management, things that are like across the stack, but still relate to the end consumer. And so they're all interrelated and important, but how it plays out is still kind of unknown. And that's what makes it so exciting.
What are some of the big trends that you're seeing that kind of lead you to believe that consumer is a real worthwhile place to be putting time currently?
So I think we can look at it from a few different perspectives. One, I think that crypto is increasingly creating new types of engagement for consumers. And so you have behaviors that existed in the past and are kind of just getting another iteration. And then you also have like new emergent behaviors that allow new types of consumption. And so like NFTs are kind of one where it bridges the line. It's somewhat in the same view of collectibles when you have some NFTs. And so like that's very much an understood user behavior. But then you have like some new types of user behavior, which is maybe like group purchasing or group investing in NFTs. DAOs kind of fit into that lens. And those types of new user behaviors are really exciting because they enable different types of applications, whether that's in investing, whether that's in consulting or other types of services that DAOs or groups might offer. And so by following kind of like the existing consumer behaviors and the new ones, those trends, I think, are what we and me, myself personally, find really fascinating.
So there's some interesting data, I think, that was shared a couple weeks ago that was sort of looking at what the first transaction type was for new users or new wallets or new addresses that were created. And through 2020, that was really DeFi related applications, right? So people are probably getting into trading or using DEXs or staking, yield farming, et cetera. And then very quickly, as sort of the NFT wave took off. So this huge spike and sort of a continued growth in NFTs kind of being that first touch point for, well, I guess like the early indication of more mainstream, or at least that next wave of users emerging. And I think a lot of that was sort of driven by speculation and by hype and excitement. And we've sort of seen that type of user behavior taper off significantly, I think, as we see in volumes drop on OpenSea and across different marketplaces. The other piece of data that's kind of interesting is that we're still seeing a ton of activity around minting, right? So even though the volumes might be dropping off, we're still seeing a lot of action. I'm curious if there's any insight in that as you sort of think through the consumer lens and where you sit.
Yeah, I think there's a couple really interesting insights there. One is the first point on, let's call it like 2020, 2021, the speculation. I think increasingly we're seeing that each of these different categories of consumer behaviors or engagements are becoming just more financial in nature. And I think that trend continues to where the game that is played in like on Wall Street of like financialization, like that is largely just bridging over to people's personal hobbies. And, we're going to see that because as you have like every type of intellectual property that moves on chain, naturally someone's hobby is going to be increasingly more financialized. And that is both a good thing and a bad thing. It really depends on, the mechanisms that we create in the next 6, 12, 18 months. So I think that's one portion of it. The other portion that you're mentioning with NFTs and like the mint volume continuing to like remain fairly the same, even across like what is like been, a couple month bear market, is a fascinating point that I think shows the people who are still building are still around. And you lost a lot of the, call it like hype or speculative consumers. And so now what you're left with is the consumers that are potentially using NFTs more for some sort of utility, some sort of community, or a use case that is not just financial in nature. And I think that's a net good thing.
Yeah, I think there's this promise of what's next with NFTs, and it's sort of like the big question mark. But I think there's a number of threads that different projects are pulling, whether it's from attestation and sort of just representing a bit of a social graph all the way through to more dynamic interactions or values that are embedded in NFTs or that NFTs kind of get plugged into. Do you think that NFTs are going to be kind of like the core primitive for Web3 consumer? Or is there something else that needs to kind of emerge to really enable us to get to that next billion people?
Most definitely. I think NFTs can get us there. If you look at NFTs to date, they've mostly focused on like everything up to the purchase point. And then everything that comes after has kind of been like an afterthought or has taken more time. That's going to flip. Like that's a very abstracted and dissimilar consumer behavior than in the traditional web, where the purchase point ends up being like the last step of what you do. As we think of like, you're going to own this NFT, it's going to be whether it's like a service, membership, some sort of other type of utility that comes after that purchase point. All the tools, all the experiences are not quite here yet, but that is what's going to bring the next billion users into crypto.
Yeah. So one of the trends that we're noticing quite a bit in working with early communities that are looking to sort of represent ownership governance in their networks, communities are networks, is that NFTs are becoming like a better early version of a social token. So we were having this conversation probably last time we chatted way back 3 decades ago, we would have been talking about social tokens, we would have been talking about ERC20s, fungible tokens, this sort of like challenges and opportunities that kind of emerged from that. And I think we saw in our last batch that sort of interest in NFTs versus fungible tokens switch to where, before 90% were looking at fungibles, now 90% are looking at NFTs. And sort of this, trend of NFTs representing ownership in networks, I think is probably the most glaring, obvious shift that we've seen since we've ran our last batch, and something that we're definitely leaning into. But I think this idea of sort of like ownership in networks is, very clearly the foundation of the thesis at Variant Fund. I remember reading Jesse's piece on this. I remember telling him this way back in the day, where it was sort of like, oh my God, somebody's finally put eloquent words together to fully capture like this feeling that I've had for a long time of like why this matters. I was very early into social media, saw the benefits, saw the downsides. I'm like, oh, this might ultimately be able to solve it. I'm curious, you're a more recent member of the Variant Fund. I'm wondering, has that thesis evolved at all? Do you have new words or language, or is it still the same? I'm curious how you guys are actually looking at like ownership in networks, or the ownership economy generally.
Yeah, I think the core thesis is still the same, that the next generation of internet protocols and platforms and applications will be owned and operated by their users. Ownership is a spectrum. And so, like certain applications, you'll have a higher level of ownership, and other applications, you might have a lower level of ownership, but that ownership will still allow you to have some sort of governance or financial or utility upside in the network that you use or contribute to. And I think that's always been the thesis, and remains the same. And, we've just seen that play out in whether it's infrastructure, DeFi, consumer. And so it's still what we broadly look at as our kind of lens of how we think Web3 plays out.
I just can't imagine anybody in the space has anything but agreement with that thesis at this point. I think there's like enough. Every time we kind of go through one of these cycles, there's sort of like this. At least I experience it, where it's like, okay, where's my conviction, right? Like, am I crazy? Because I think we can be off the edge of our skis so often, and to me, it always comes back to that. Like a world where we have ownership in the networks that are absolutely essential to coordination of all economic activity, which is like the world we live in right now. Like, I just don't think we have a healthy middle class, healthy society without all that stuff. There's just some very obvious challenges that kind of come up with that. And maybe I'll get your take on a few of the biggest ones I see, and maybe you can add a couple more in.
Yeah.
To me, like the biggest question I think is like, do people really want ownership? And so I think like it's easy to say, yes, I want ownership in a thing, but like ownership also comes with a degree of responsibility, like to have self-ownership, to have ownership in a network. Are we ready for that? Because I think most people aren't.
Yeah, I think it's super specific to the network. So, like, you could take a parallel of like a stock where you own this stock, you have some sort of like voting power in this network, and like that's about it. And then maybe you have like a right to a dividend. And a lot of people are passive and don't vote. And maybe that's like fine for certain types of companies versus like other types of networks that, say you have a social media network and users are able to kind of like control the algorithm. That might be something that more users would have an input on, because you could reflect the algorithm based on like what people think is like more ethical or right, compared to monetization from some company like Instagram or Facebook or whoever. Insert your favorite.
Well, they tried to bring the algorithms to my Instagram feed, and thank goodness we had Twitter so we could push back against that change. And then I would also like to use Twitter to push back against whatever the hell they're showing me these days in my Twitter feed here. Yeah, I think I agree. I think like it's interesting that we're sort of in this phase right now where most of these projects are still very, very small. And I think we've started to come through this wave very much in the world that we live in of DAOs and community tokens, where this idea of like, okay, well, everybody's going to come in, have ownership, have equal opportunity to participate, et cetera. And I think there's any number of challenges with, expectation of participation in ownership and governance in a meaningful way, because the reality is to be up to date enough to have the information and the context to be able to actually be a very active participant at the most core level of these things requires a ton of time and effort. And so looking at them as companies, I think, is probably in a similar way that a company structure is, where you have concentrated power, you have core teams, you have a board, you have all the governance structures, and then you also have holders who do have a vote. But I guess I sort of wonder if that is the world that we're in, where most people are just holding from a more speculative standpoint and not from a governance standpoint. Is that enough?
I think governance is an interesting question, because like if you look at a DeFi protocol, something like Compound Maker, like the governance and responsibility there like has a higher level degree of challenge, because like you have to understand the risk of adding some new collateral to Maker. And so the optimal like governance structure there might not be you have every single token holder like weighing in their unadvised opinion, but different applications can have like a broader sense of community ownership and governance. I still think we're going to get some sort of hierarchical relation, and whether that's delegates, which is like pretty commonly used today. One kind of version is that we use delegates and we end up having more delegates that are global, that are able to kind of take a viewpoint that people agree with. And so you're able to kind of more liquidly assign that voting power. And maybe that's like a 10x better governance structure. It's kind of hard to say, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think our general experience is that we need more leaders and we need more structure. And that the ultimate promise of getting those sort of wider concentric circles of participation comes from building more clear mechanisms for that participation to be focused and effective rather than the big blob that we have right now. And so I think like two compelling ideas right now, I think maybe just evolve the delegate mechanism is to have those delegates form more of what would, I guess, in the Web 2 world or traditional world be seen as like a board, right? Where they're more formal roles, there's still some voting going on and delegating going on to who should be on there, but that there's sort of this like high bar held there, and that those people are specifically putting the time in to overcome that information asymmetry and then sort of be part of like the broader share out. I think you see ENS delegates and Gitcoin delegates are sort of some examples here. In Gitcoin, where I have a little bit more familiarity, there's like a ton of effort being put into that just to stay up to date and manage it. But I don't think it's effective in its current structure because those people aren't paid. Tough to sort of share out who's doing what, doing well. So I think that's the right direction, but there's some more interesting things to be done there. If there are governance structures that I'm most excited about, what the Little Nouns team sort of rolled out recently, it almost looked like a Hacker News site where you could come in and put an idea, and then there was token weighted voting on voting those up. And I think they'll do it over a set period of time. So there's sort of a way of making it seem like, okay, we have this place to capture ideas and for the community to help sort them, and at least sort of create this like new layer of insight and sort of heartbeat, I guess, from the community. And so I think like that's a very simple thing that they've rolled out there. But I think these structures that allow for more formal engagement, but not in ones that have like massive, because, if somebody puts forth a governance proposal that they've spent a lot of time working on, there's been a whole lot of conversations happening in discourse and in Discord, and all this content is built up, and then all of a sudden it gets put out there, and then there's 10 comments that haven't taken into any account of all that work that's gone in, even if it was kind of public, but it's kind of hard to keep up to date with. It just becomes sort of this really destabilizing or frustrating type of a process. So I think we kind of need to like create pathways for those things to exist and add a little bit more structure to them. Don't know what that exactly looks like, but I would say those are two of the interesting pieces for me.
No, I agree with that. And to the extent that like structure in any type of early stage company, like structure is important because you need to be able to iterate and move quickly in order to capture a market, iterate on your product, whatever it is. And that's like a unique challenge that crypto often faces because you have people who like progressively decentralize too quickly. And there's not really like a great handoff in whether it's leadership or task assignment. And so like the incentives get out of whack between the people who kind of carry the baton. And I think we've seen that historically. And so having more structure along the lines of like leadership, delegation, and having them have like real power is super important. But I also agree with your point how we should still allow for the kind of like plentiful idea creation at the base level. Like anyone should be able to add or contribute an idea, but there should be an element of structure that determines like what comes next.
Yeah, because there are a lot of horrible, horrible ideas out there. I'm looking at, I'm going to call some people out here right now. I'm looking at the Joke DAO. So David Phelps and Packy, and I think somebody else put a piece out on sort of like forking governance or bottom up sort of governance participation. Lovely insight. I have some major disagreements with like the suggestions there, but that's not the point here. Maybe I'll talk to David about that specifically another time. What they did was they said, okay, well, hey, if you react to this Twitter post, drop your ENS, we'll give you some voting power and you can help make suggestions and choose which topics Packy will write next. Well, if you go into this list, as of right now, maybe the world gets better over the next couple of days before this comes out, but those are some awful, poorly formatted. I don't even know how you'd even make sense of what this thing, GTP3, it would be like a significant improvement to most of the things that are coming here. And so I think that's sort of like, it's fun to get to go play with sort of this open, wild participation. And then ultimately, there's a pragmatism that needs to be brought into these systems to be able to move things forward. And I think what's interesting is seeing a number of teams kind of feel their way through where that line should be drawn. And I think my experience in Web3, at least in building C Club, would probably best be demonstrated by just like this pendulum moving back and forth and probably spinning erratically at the same time. Like you're just trying to like go until you feel the edge and be like, okay, that's maybe a little bit too far and probably gonna go too far
Yeah.
the other way. And I think a lot of, at least what I'm trying to pay attention to and how teams are going out and sort of trying to solve the multitude of problems that kind of exist in the space is how they're feeling their way through those edges, because it's going to be different for every project, as you said. But I think there's going to be a lot of insights sort of pulled out from that. And definitely one of the ones that we have is like, just take your time. Like there was never a world where we're like, you should just go mint your token in day one and send it to everybody and let's just go have fun. But I think there's even more sort of fine tuning to that model around like how long can you actually go and what proof points can you build in? And maybe even more importantly, what sort of culture can you build here that can kind of hold this space to allow for that experimentation to happen?
Yeah, and I mean to that point, I think it matters on like what you're building. So like to the extent like I'm not super familiar with JokeDAO, but like it seems very much just like a fun project that is just like trying to like build a community and kind of like see what experiments it can run. And I think that that's like totally fine for a lot of projects. And then something like Maker is probably like the opposite example of like they were very methodical in how they built out that protocol, the token economic design, because like you do have less of an opportunity to build that plane midair.
My hope with Joke DAO is it is a thing that is fun and creates that sort of space to go and do those experimentations. But I think there's a nugget of something interesting in there. They're going to enable us more bottom up decision making or governance process potentially. That we'll see where the edges are there in similar ways that like Prop House in the Nouns ecosystem is kind of flipping some of the more traditional assumptions on what like a proposal should be. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just generally a fan of like more people at more edges pushing more novel things forward.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the great part about Web3 is you get a lot of recycling. And so someone pushes too far over like one ledge here, but like there was like a nugget of genius. And so you can like take that and adapt that. And, like everything is just kind of, like you said, like kind of finding where the line is between like, this is a great idea and, oh my God, like, what have I done?
I love how we can just sort of go down into these like deep rabbit holes of nuance, and sort of the realization I have very regularly is like, okay, like we're talking our own book here. We're sort of very much drank the Kool-Aid, whatever the right term is. But we're also in this sort of phase right now where there's sort of like a broader questioning of this space. And this idea of like, we were talking about sort of esoteric experiments at the edge of Web3, there's still like this whole host of big barriers, either from a narrative standpoint, I mean, everything's a scam standpoint, or like Ponzi schemes, et cetera standpoint. I know one of the areas that you sort of spend a lot of time on is thinking about Web3 creator monetization. I know Variant is sort of in that space as well. Obviously, we've put a lot of thought into this as well. I'm curious from like, if we just sort of step up into the very meta level here, the meme of like, what's Web3 even good for? How are you answering that question right now?
I think the lens in which you answer that question always depends on who you're talking to, because like very rarely are you able to provide one definition where someone understands it completely. And so approaching it from their frame of reference, I find is like always the most important definition. I think like you can approach it from a variety of use cases. Like one is talking about the importance of ownership. Some people that doesn't like make sense to them. It's kind of abstract. And so it's just easier to talk about how stable coins are, multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry and that is happening today constantly. So it's like, I find that if you can meet people where they are or provide them examples that exist today, it tends to be like the most effective description.
I think we've seen so much of this interest in this last wave driven by the fact that we have what I often think about, just the internet came about in a time where there wasn't the internet before. Like I think we probably would have called each other up on a rotary phone at some point and been like, yo, are you on the internet yet type thing. And then, crypto comes along and definitely this last wave with NFTs comes along when, everybody's on TikTok. There's sort of this like broad world of ideas being spread, which that is a network itself, and networks tend to overshoot, or at least can sort of send a lot of velocity one way, and so we get maybe more of a hype around something. But it also provides sort of like this place to have those more nuanced conversations as you're talking about there. But I think this role of like the creator, which is obviously expanding and broad, is a very important one in the space, both from building deep trusted relationships and having the space and the faith in somebody's point of view to be able to have that extra heartbeat or extra breath that kind of allows for a more nuanced conversation. I'm curious from the broader lens of creators, I know you guys have done a bunch of investments in this space. I know you've thought about this quite a bit. I'm curious how you sort of see the role of creator in Web3 and maybe what's your answer to like what Web3 does for somebody who is seeing themselves as an independent creator?
When we kind of take a step back and examine like what creators want today, I think that it's largely greater control, greater ability to monetize their user base and engage with their audience. Some platforms offer a variety of ways to do that, and most creators kind of act as these like singular points, and then they have maybe one, two, three channels that they use. And so it's really hard to bridge all those channels, and it's really hard to monetize within them. That's why like a lot of times influencers go through brands or some other like roundabout mechanism. And so that's why NFTs are so fascinating, because it provides them a new monetization mechanism that can traverse those different social networks potentially, or provide a deeper level of connection for the people who are most incentivized to care. Because like any creator, it's very much a 80-20 rule, where you have 20% who care really deeply and the other 80% that are, engaged, and they'll watch your videos or, find where you are, but aren't as incentivized to pay. And that kind of varies by different creative field, whether it's art or music or something else.
Yeah, I think Chris Dixon's piece that sort of shows being able to capture more of the variable demand in communities is really interesting, right? There's a small number of people who would pay any amount of money to hang out with you, Mason, and then there's like a whole lot of others who'd be like,
No, no
okay,
one's paying any money to hang out with me,
like I'll
Jess.
tip him a couple cents here just because he's sent a couple good tweet threads. But I think that is interesting to be able to sort of think through that dynamic a little bit more. I think that case you sort of laid out there is, I think, what we're seeing the early stages of, which is like, and it's happening a lot in music NFTs. Music's such a fascinating space for me because it's where the greatest pain for the creator lives is still in musicians. I think there's shitty deals. Spotify's not great for most people. They're very sort of up and down. And so you're seeing like creators start to drop NFTs. And I think we're starting to see collector communities form around them, or at least they're able to represent those collector communities. And this idea of being able to sort of siphon attention from the audience that you may have built across multiple channels and formalize them in a community, maybe a smaller community with higher touch, et cetera, I think is super interesting. But it sort of starts to look a lot like these sort of, I guess, independent islands of collector bases that are then tied together through Web2 tools that are, still algorithmically curated in many ways and kind of hard to still capture that attention in the same way. And so, I think we're starting to see a number of projects that are launching that are trying to think about like, what does the reaggregation of those communities look like? I'm curious on your thoughts on that. Like, do you think we're going to start to see, is there a Facebook 2.0 that is actually bringing together these types of things? Or what sort of evolution of these independent communities do you sort of see happening as they go from truly early adopter users into the more mainstream?
The end state is interesting because it likely ends in some form of aggregation. But like there's certain user behaviors that people don't want to change. For example, like in the music industry, creators, artists want to make more, but users still don't want to go back to like paying for each additional song. Like that's probably not a user behavior that we go back to. Like music is going to be free or aggregated at some point. And the question is, how can we make new mechanisms that increase the value for creators? And so whether that's obfuscating some of the middlemen, whether that's having new types of experiences, or doing stuff with royalties that allow for more money to flow to the creator's pocket or get leverage somewhere that ends up being more beneficial for them.
Sort of the business model of the internet is like bundling and unbundling, or bundling again. Like it's just sort of back and forth between it. So I think it's probably inevitable that we get some sort of rebundling of the unbundling of the bundling of the unbundling as life goes on through the internet. And at the same time, what I'm seeing, at least with talking to so many builders of DAOs and communities, is just how much they want to kind of build this world of which people can kind of come and participate in. And that is like, from a Seed Club perspective, like I would really like to not be building on Discord as like a core thing. Like there isn't actually a whole lot of network effect value that we get from building on Discord, and the likelihood that most of our interactions as we start to build structures in our DAO, further build the structures, will happen in what I guess would probably best be described as like a Seed Club app. And so I see these communities and DAOs turning into more app-like experiences than us going and building on these networks and supporting other individual network effects. And one of the core pieces there is I think there's enough variability in the type of interactions or the ways that value is created that at the very least there are going to be like a fairly fragmented number of these things. Like running an accelerator as the core thing a community does is very different than collecting NFTs is very different than playing video games. So there's similarities, but meaningful enough differences in how you actually need to like ultimately create value there. So I don't know if maybe we're in a world where there's a lot more fragmentation. Maybe we figure out how to crack the code of the best software and social stack to be able to go and run accelerators, and everything runs on something that we've helped to co-build. I feel like this is where it feels so much more like Web 1 to me than anything else, which is like you're having these sort of, it's more like Amazon for retail, and maybe that's not a good example. But
So one question, because I would love to unpack that, because like if you think of most enterprises today that use Slack, for example, like they're probably going to tell you they love it because it's a great tool. Like it just makes all internal communication really easy, and then emails for everything else. For some reason in Web3, like in DAOs, like we don't have that. Like everyone uses Discord for everything, which kind of makes it a nightmare. And so I'm curious to see if like there is a general communication tool that can work for these organizations, or like you said, do they need to be their standalone apps? I kind of lean that there will be some type of tool that people use, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, because Discord is often cited as an issue, but yet we use it. And so I'm curious as to why you think that is, and what specifically needs to happen to switch over to something else.
yeah, I mean, I think it's you sort of Discord's in your Slack example there. That's like, how do we come together and communicate as teams? And it's real time messaging. This is like a better real time messaging app, like text messaging or Telegram or whatever. I think
Mm-hmm.
really the piece that's kind of being done really poorly in Discord and is spread across multiple other places is more of like the enterprise stack that sort of would run the distribution center at Walmart, or would sort of the analytics, the project management. It probably looks a lot more like Salesforce, or like the software that's underpinning a business. And the difference being that you're actually building it in with more of a consumer mindset, because you have this sort of blurring the lines between who's an employee or a contributor and who's sort of like a member. I think there's going to be enough variability or bespoke requirements from a team that's trying to build an accelerator versus a team that's trying to go build the next amazing fashion brand, that those stacks are going to be meaningfully different, because the ability to actually tap into the broader community to be useful at that specific thing is going to dictate structure that is geared towards the type of value that's being created there. So I don't think it's so much about like needing to remove Discord or removing Slack. I think there's a good chance that like those Web 2 networks are just going to be better at what they're doing. Like I'm not big bullish on, I mean, I've been using Farcaster a lot lately, so follow me on Farcaster. I'm Jess on Farcaster. Let's go. But I think it's my first Farcaster plug. But I'm also not a believer that Twitter gets disintermediated or Facebook. I just don't think we see those behaviors ever, really. So I'm not super bullish on like the Web3, Spotify or whatever. I am very much about like, how do we go use those things effectively? But I think the places that I'm specifically interested in is that outside of a few consistent behaviors, like I think we look at like collect NFTs together or form capital and send capital to places. You can see the Prisms and the Coops, and maybe what NASDAQ is building is really good examples of that. But for anything that requires a lot more ingenuity and collaboration, the how to do that in a scalable way, I think is very, very challenging. And it's not going to be some workflow in what is otherwise a social app or chat app, etc.
No, I think that's a good point. And you're right, it does vary by the type of use case. I'm curious if, and this is just like one kind of like, we talked about how structure is really important in DAOs. And so sometimes I wonder if the problem with Discord is not that it is a channel with everyone, but there is a lack of structure, or, there's not like a specific target role for every role. And so like sometimes that leads to the breakdown.
I just don't think like real-time chat is the right format for deep, valuable work. And so I think it looks probably more like the forum is probably a better starting point for this stuff than Discord is. An example you can see live right now is the accelerator.cclub.xyz, right? Like this is the challenge that C Club has, is like we get hundreds of applications that come in. We want our community to be deeply involved in the curation of those applications. How do you surface the right information, design for the right interactions, ensure that it's a valuable process for the projects that are applying, and we can then co-create value as users? And there's just nothing that exists out there that really would allow us to do it. And it would be carnage in Discord. It wouldn't, and previously we had used Mirror's
Yeah.
race for it as well, right? And so I think that's just like a little baby example. We're also working on a tool that is specifically geared towards creating the social interactions within our community of, a couple hundred builders that are in it and our alumni network, to actually create value for those folks, like the social interactions that we want to drive there, again, lost in the mix of Discord notifications and Telegram chats, etc. And so I think just those two examples alone, and nice to start to sort of game out where they evolve to in the future. And I think you also add on the fact that so many of these organizations are capitalized and have access to talent and can kind of go and build and solve those problems themselves. So my belief is that it will be communities and DAOs solving their own problems, and then we'll see a bunch of those tools generalize, which will then either be mechanisms or platforms that will then be used by teams that are trying to do similar functions. And we can see this already with, the Gnosis Safe, with Coordinate, Snapshot. I think the list will continue to grow.
I like that point of you see a lot of people just building on top of tools that are already super useful. So like Gnosis Safe is like a classic example of this is a very useful tool. Like multi-sig is like a core need. How can we integrate it? And you've seen a lot of projects like build on top of that and integrate some form of a multi-sig, whether Gnosis Safe or something else.
And maybe that's the point of aggregation. It just kind of maybe looks a little bit different, right? Like I've seen many, many startups that have come through that are building better user experiences on top of the Gnosis Safe. Like why would you go and recreate that functionality when it's open source and you can kind of go build on it and it's trusted? Same thing with a lot of mint sites around Zora. Or so it's interesting in that I think there really will be these incredibly valuable, powerful networks that kind of act as aggregators, but are mostly probably open source software that have built a useful tool, but importantly have a very valuable brand on top of it, so you can trust that group. And those two things together will give a number of teams the ability to kind of play further up the stack and build some sort of differentiated experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you think the end state is that you have, similar to how the open source works today, where you have like one team building out their core protocol, like Gnosis maintaining, Gnosis Safe, Gnosis multi-sig, or do you think that like it ends up being more like a protocol is launched and it, can kind of run and exist and people can just iterate however they want and whatever the end use application ends up just being where everyone kind of goes to?
I think it's probably both. Like I think likely like for Gnosis Safe's example, like they are so close to the user and the consumer. That's like the powerful position to be in. I think it's, if they needed to go further down the stack and build out a protocol, they'd be in the best position to go do it. I think it would be more difficult for somebody to come the other direction. But I also don't think they necessarily need to do it, though I'm sure there would be other applications that would see the need for some infrastructure or throughput need that they would sort of want to own more of that stack. But I think you start to get into something like Gnosis Safe that starts to look a lot more protocol-y, even if you probably wouldn't call it a protocol, because they're just sort of constantly opening up new functionality and tools and APIs. And I'm not the technical guy here that's going to draw a specific line between what is a protocol and what is a platform or tool. I'm assuming there's a debate around that. But I do think it's sort of like, yeah, you'll get these, like projects a little earlier in that process is what Coordinate is trying to do, right? Like they've said, hey, Wi-Fi had this issue of like, how do we actually allocate funds to our team members in a fair, open, decentralized way? And they built this really simple mechanism. Well, I think they have a head start to kind of be like the capital allocation or human curated capital allocation layer in Web3. And now the question is like, where else should that be extended to be like just the most useful piece to go plug into that part of the stack for these other DAOs? And same with Snapshot, right? Like there was a world where when I first got into DAOs, it was Argon and it was DAO Stack. And we launched the first version of C Club on Argon. And I was like, geez, we can't do this all on chain. Like this is just insane. It was $14 to cast a vote. And Snapshot has come out and they made it incredibly easy to build strategies. And so now there's this whole ecosystem of strategies being developed. And I know they've raised some money recently. And so my expectation is that they will just continue to kind of like expand their tentacles in that layer. And, at a certain point, maybe they do move up or move down the stack there. But in the short term, I think there's probably a ton of value in just kind of being that thing. And my guess is we'll see that throughout the stack of what makes up a DAO, right? And it'll be interesting to see sort of if there are just sort of one or two big players in those spaces, or in some places, maybe there's just a lot more tools that kind of roll out. I mean, I saw a tweet today that was sort of saying like 70% of all applications and contracts on Ethereum trace their roots back or use 15 early contracts that were created. So there's like this immense focused sort of development that exists already. And it's just because like, why would you need to go rebuild that thing? But I think I contrast this with my most hated idea out there on the internet for DAOs, which is this like, your one-stop shop, build an all-in-one tool where your DAOs are going to be able to go do everything. And I'm like, no, I don't. No. First of all, you don't know what you're talking about. And even if you do know what you're talking about right now, you're not going to know what you're going to be talking about in 6 months because we just know things change quickly. And so this idea of trading off sovereignty over this world for building within your I'm going to call it a walled garden. That's maybe an overly negative way of describing it, but you're ultimately I'm putting my eggs in your basket and therefore trusting that you're going to be able to innovate as fast as the broader Ethereum ecosystem is just like highly unlikely in my mind.
Yeah. You make a lot of interesting points there. One is like I agree the 15 or whatever how many contracts like bridge back to being used is fascinating. I mean that's why like standards are awesome because like they allow you to just like build composably and really quickly. But there also is like the caveat of is ERC 721 the best standard or like could we be using a standard with like a native royalty? Like that would be really cool, but it just like gets harder to use because like the infrastructure built on top of it just integrates what was there and what was possible. So it's like a double-edged sword. In the DAOs and like building like this like all-encompassing DAO tool, I agree with you that you're not going to get like one size fits all, at least like not for like the next decade until it's like aggregated. But that's I think more a factor of the DAO is so broad. Like it could be an investment DAO, it could be a service DAO, it could be like another type of DAO that's trying to be a protocol DAO. And so like the tools each of those need are so unique and specific, and the users they serve are so specific that I see more frameworks for kind of each of those types of DAOs rather than one encompassing.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, we see like Syndicate and Kali and Tribute Labs doing this sort of like the most well-defined use case for DAO is like an investment group, and we're seeing some pretty consistent models that are evolving there, though there's still a ton of innovation happening. And
yeah, well, and that makes sense because like the first use case of Ethereum is capital coordination, and like that has been like the continued use case of like crypto is like the first one in like every new genre is like capital coordination, and so like it just makes sense that like that would be the first.
So I had a conversation with Tom from Archive a couple weeks back, and one of the things that stood out to me was how we were approaching things in very similar ways. Like we both saw specific user behaviors emerging in our community or ones that we wanted to support. We realized the existing software that were out there wasn't supporting it. We've been able to form capital and bring resources to the table. And so we're building out two very similar tools. They have this thing called Atrium. It's going to help decision making and sort of provide a better point of interaction for curation of which, it's basically a decentralized IRL museum. And, C Clubs, again, we're trying to build a curation tool for projects and builders, and then also ways of sort of connecting them together to ensure we get that value. I'm really curious to think about how many segments are going to ultimately emerge in this DAO space, because you're very right. Right now, it's one big club that we're trying to hit everything over the head with. And I think, one of the big challenges we have is like, what is the right word to use to describe the things that we want to back and be a part of? Like, is it DAOs? Because that kind of leaves a lot out as far as I'm concerned. Is it tokenized communities? Not really. Like now I just have to drop a huge long list of the dozen things I think would be kind of cool. And, if somebody has a better word for it, I'm all ears.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And it's also tough because certain tools that you want are hard to monetize. If you look at Telegram, for example, like it's an application that everyone uses, but like wallet like messaging is like super commoditized, even though it's like a very time consuming thing to like build. And so like the question is when we get to DAOs, like what are the really time consuming things to build that get standardized? And then what are the things that are time consuming to build and important that are monetizable?
The way that I look at it from a C Club perspective is we don't need to monetize any of those things. What we are doing there is investing in building things that will make us better at the thing that drives our organization, which is finding the best people, finding the best projects, supporting them into launching very valuable things that we get to have a stake in moving forward. And so I often refer to it as the Costco model. It's like one low membership fee, you get in, and why would we need to, you get the hot dogs for $1 forever, the true stable coin, in the world.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like interesting that where value will get pushed. And I do think like the big question mark in so many of these tools is what is the model that actually unlocks value here? Because I think many of the ones that we're talking about right now, I would argue that the value is almost more in the brand or the meme than it is in like the value flow that happens through it. And so people will want to have an ownership, like we'll see being a supporter of or an owner in that as valuable, even if there isn't like a direct cash flow that kind of comes from it. That's not the case for everything. I think there's obviously, the best is probably a strong brand with great cash flow, but I think it's a big open question.
In regards to, because C Club is now starting its 5th cohort, what do you see as like the thing that will like most change like cohort to cohort, like historically, or what do you think is like changing in this next one?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is just how fast the meme of building a Web3 or like the ownership economy or ownership in networks is sort of taking off. And what that means is that people are coming a lot more prepared to go and be effective builders in this space. If we think about the first 2 or 3 cohorts we ran, there's still a lot of mutual sense making that was going on there around even what this is. And I think right now we're starting to see enough, there's enough models to even say, here's a few frameworks that you can use as the building point. Now take those and kind of into your own thing, which I think is going to just mean that there's a lot more velocity and speed to market, that there's a lot more rapid iteration and maybe just more consistency in sort of how these things start and launch. And I think that'll be a good thing because the challenge in crypto is that it's very hard to sort of say the thing you want to say as directly as you want to say it. And instead what we need to have is like proof in the pudding and demonstration of like, it's like, okay, yeah. So like, if I go use Uniswap and then all of a sudden I get an airdrop of tokens, that's kind of cool. Maybe I should go use other things. I think continuing to prove out those models is going to be big. And so I think, yeah, teams are coming better prepared. There's more clarity on how to go build things. The big question marks are still over sustainability and value flow and value capture. That's token design, if you will. Like that still lives in the broader crypto space as well. We're all sort of encountering that. But I think there's a lot more examples of people being able to go, oh, that's the thing that I'm into, or something like that I might be into. And so people then become interested, start participating, and we have more talent and excitement and interest. And so those experiments start to happen a lot faster. And just the volume as well. I think like, I remember for our second batch, people going like, what even is this sort of thing? And I'd be like, yeah, well, I don't know, like it's a thing. We're going to try to bring people together. It's going to be cool. Now people are calling us the Web3 Y Combinator, which is cool, I guess. I mean, we'd love to have that sort of impact or more on the world. But I used to fight that term quite a bit more because it's very much not what we're trying to build. But ultimately, this idea of like being the place where builders come to kind of co-create things and sort of tap into a network and sort of jump off into the world in a stronger position is very much what we want. And in that way, I think we sort of model that. So I think if in a similar way that sort of, outreach sort of like the lean startup and all of a sudden this sort of whole new world of type of builder starts to come out, I think we're getting close to that phase within Web3.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And I'll be curious to see like what the kind of cohort looks like because we are at such like a different point where there might be like new types of communities enabled, which is like the really exciting part.
Yeah, I think the biggest shift that we've been seeing beyond what I shared earlier with sort of like the token types is just how many more teams are building tools, platforms with the idea of being community owned from the start. Not necessarily the community ownership would happen from the start, but that the intention is very clearly for it to be exited to the community or for there to be community ownership. And so it's allowed us to sort of like we were almost forced to say, well, yeah, how do we make something that's very useful for, like a Kali DAO that came through our last batch, very essential infrastructure as far as we're concerned. They reducing the friction that legal and lawyers kind of bring into starting DAOs and communities. And, can you just have like a push of a button and have a DAO that's wrapped in a legal structure and rock and roll? Super useful. Probably not what we were looking as like the core type of dynamic or project that we would have been working with previously. And I think just from early applications so far, I think we're seeing a lot more builders that are coming into the network. So that's super exciting. I think like we just want to be the place where if you were building for the ownership economy, I'll use your language, I think, and you want some support in doing that well. If C Club can kind of build that network that does it well, and it can then introduce these projects and founders to this incredible network of investors and users and members that we're able to bring together through lovely supportive folks like yourselves, I think that gets really exciting.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
All right, man. We just like went off a cliff here talking about all sorts of esoteric stuff, but that's exactly what I love about this podcast. These are the types of conversations that you and I would have just over Zoom and, sort of opening that up here and recording it. At least, I don't know, it makes me feel good. I don't know I think people like it.
Yeah. I mean, I think so much of the exciting part is like getting into the nuance, and that is hard to do in a lot of settings. So being able to do that and explore, and most of the time it's just open questions and people putting out, their interpretation or their experience or whatever it is. And that's where oftentimes the insight comes from. So I think this is always like, this is my definition of fun.
I agree, man. And I think it's a privilege that we get to have conversations like this with folks who've, invested so much of their heartbeats in trying to figure this stuff out. It's kindred spirits in it. Things for us to talk about next time that I think are maybe spicy takes, but we're not going to get into. But I'm just going to tease a little bit here because people can, I want to give you an opportunity just to share where people can find you on the internet. I think you had a really spicy take around play to earn, something I very, very much agree with, sort of like the current mechanisms in play to earn might not be the right ones, or at least the current gaming model has several severe flaws that prevent its long-term success, I think is the language you've used there. Definitely a wonderful piece to get into. And the other piece is like, you took a lot of great care in trying to define the metaverse, which I think is just like so important right now because I think most people are full of shit when they're talking about this, quite frankly. And there's another data point that came out that was sort of exploring consumer understanding of what the metaverse is and what business, like, I think the question was like, do you know what the metaverse is? And like 80% of executives said they did, and like 4% of consumers said they did. And I'm like looking at that 80%, and I'm like, I bet you there's like barely a thread between all of your understandings of what the metaverse is here. So you wrote a great piece on that starts to really try to break a bunch of these pieces down. And I think that's what I enjoy most about our conversations in the past and the work that you put out into the world. You have just a wonderful macro understanding of things, and you sort of slice it up into frameworks, mental frameworks, ways of understanding these very complex topics. So where can people find you on the internet, or see some of this writing?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Mason Nystrom. All my hot takes, bad takes, incorrect takes will be there first and foremost. And then you can also follow my newsletter, Unsyndicated, on Substack, where you can read more of the long form wrong takes.
I mean, your hot takes are great. They've got a little less spicy since you joined Variant, so I don't know what's going on over there, Mason. I'm watching you. I want to make sure that you're not starting to self-censor here a little bit now you've gone into the investor side of things. So I'm just going to put
Never,
that out there,
never.
but definitely never. The newsletter is something to make sure it's on your reading list. Yeah, I think you'll find a lot of value on it. So I encourage you to go subscribe over there. Mason, appreciate your time, man, as always, and look forward to seeing you on the internet.
Thanks, Jess.